Oh, there we are. I'm very interested in what you were saying there, Randy, about the capacity of symbol connecting with sort of the psychoanalytic tradition, and particularly a phrase that you repeated a few times, which I find very fascinating, is this idea of the pulling together. Because of course, for me, it begs something like, is there a puller? Is there some kind of, and you talked about an internal gravity, which seems similar. What is the function? What is the process which allows for symbol to be generative of meaning? It's particularly interesting when I consider something like hell, which for me has this interesting double usage as a symbol, but also as a category for symbolism. It in itself not requiring any individual symbol, but allowing for the communication of a shared realm of meaning. Your hell and my hell may look very different, and yet somehow we can agree upon the concept of hell, and what Jung thinks as well, which I find very, very fascinating. So I'm wondering, as we get into this a little bit, how we have that conversation. It reminds me of Conrad-Martius talking a little bit about the givenness of objects. So I just wanted to place that on the table there as something that I found very interesting, what you were saying. Hopefully we can dive into it as we go today. So, cheers.
Yeah, thank you. Jim, do you want to say something about heaven and hell?
I want to say something about everything, of course. The Bill's point here is I'm reluctant to use myth without specifying what we mean by it. And Bill's point that it's what gives rise to thought, and it recurs working in the symbolism of evil, and in the fallible man, and so forth, in the voluntary and the involuntary. There is a there's phenomenology going on. To use the necessary language, there's first-person experiences which have an immediate access, and they're not like the experiences we have of the world. And so when we're talking about what psychoanalysis might well be, sharing with us, and where we have to acknowledge that we're not thinking, we're not doing phenomenology, at least at an explicit level. We just to throw out dreams, or throw out random experiences, or private worlds. And there are, as I think it was Bill saying, it's kind of like a private mythology, but that we really don't want to let it stay there. It's inauthentic. It's not honest to rest in an unexamined world of idiosyncratic perceptions. So to make a long story short, it seems to me that if Ricoeur could serve as a paradigm, and I'm not sure he does here, but we wind up with Ricoeur an analysis of the will, an analysis of the imagination. And ultimately we wind up with a philosophical, phenomenological anthropology of human frailty, and the fallibility, and the contingency, and how then we can use myths, and how myths got us there, but how myths also might shed further light and enlarge in what might be called then the free imaginative variation of these themes that we have first-person access to, and which should not be, and because, but they're also essences, and therefore they're not just my private world. It's a discourse which has a community of listeners and readers and interlocutors and so forth. So that would be cover maybe some of the points of view here. There was something else that I wanted to say, and I forget what it was. It'll come back, I'm sure.
Renee, do you want to voice what you just wrote in there, if you're available? And you can jump in. I just want to point to it for us. Renee mentions that according to Ricoeur, the symbolic in a metaphorical story is its aspect of realism. I find that point really interesting. He goes on the basis of this hypothesis, we will have determined the aspect which transforms the poetics of the parable into a poetics of faith. Thus, religious language also acts as a model for the whole of human experience. So religious language and myth and metaphor and symbol have this sense of realism. And what I was listening to someone talk about Jung, and that inspired me to go back to the Red Book. And there are these like two senses of realism that I thought I should bring to the webinar here. One is our like usual like Western concept. Actually, this guy said it's inspired by Disney to separate reality deriving from the Latin res, or the thing, from this fantasy that Walt Disney says is supposed to be totally separate from reality. So there's this is how this guy characterized the like Western idea of reality versus imagination and versus fantasy. And in contrast to that, Carl Jung, for example, had this idea of the German word Wirklichkeit as being more like the effectual, or the actualizing, and the what has an effect on you. Like in a dream, there's this this context that develops, and you can confirm it, validate it according to maybe dream logic, or according to the kind of the dream body, right? The kind of hyletic substantiality that you're experiencing in that dream. You can kick a stone and verify it in a dream, right? So his point was that Wirklichkeit is more a sense of reality that includes all these other possible realms, like dream.
Well, but what if we just go back to Conrad-Martius, I mean, it's terribly important for her that we have this category of the really real. And it's very important for Husserl to have the category of the really real. And that for her, because it's extendable to our third person experience of the world, and that there's a sense in which reality, and but it's Husserl too, most of our verification, we don't verify most of our first person lived experience. There's no question about their veracity. But the discussion, say, in the sixth logical investigation, is typically giving examples of propositions that are proposed for our belief. They're given to us in terms of significative meanings, significations, by having read something or having listened to somebody say something, and we emptily intend these. But when we find that what is reported, what has been narrated, what has been said, is able to be substantiated in the world of perception, we have a filled intention. Now, that filled intention itself is of a proposition or a claim or a narrative, but we might want to look at it more closely. What is there about? What precisely Husserl brackets? What is there about it that enables us to talk about the real as the real? And she goes into her whole dance, her whole ballet, her whole orchestration of something that is founded in itself from out of itself. And that leads into the whole realm of potentialities and so forth. Randy made the point about the whole realm of meanings behind everything else. That's true, but it's not just meanings. It's just not abstract formal objects, or even square circles. Impossible objects. They're among the realm of meanings. What consciousness is able to entertain. There is the real, and there's the really real. Hmm? But because she sees in the reality of things a kind of dunamis, a kind of potentiality of self-actualization, she has this whole realm of the entelechies. Hmm? And the entelechies are manifest themselves depending on the kinds of beings. And there's certain square circles are never going to be part of the cosmos. Hmm? As part of the real cosmos. The square root, the concept of the square root isn't something that you can stub your toe on. Hmm? It's not something you're going to fall in love with, strictly speaking. So there are different kinds of noema. There are varieties of objects, and we do make a distinction between kinds of ideal objects, but eventually we come down to real objects. And interestingly enough, first personal experience is not a real object in the way a filled intention is of somebody's narrative or someone's proposition in the third person. Now, when Husserl, we're reading Husserl, reading Merleau-Ponty or whomever, or Paul Ricoeur, and we are making, you have empty intentions. What the hell is he talking about? A fortiori, maybe with Conrad-Martius. But if we get it, there's a filled intention, but that of which it's a filled intention oftentimes is not part of the real world. But it's still part of the cosmos noetos. And to understand in her terms why these the parts of the cosmos noetos are entelechies, and they are the founding dimensions of everything. That goes back to Randy's point, that's the fundamental consideration. But entelechies aren't things. They're not trees or fire hydrants or horses or things like that. But they're also the basis for protons. They're also the basis for electrons, for gravity waves, and this, that, and the other thing. And to move into that dimension, I think is what she's trying to do, and it's very difficult.
And I think,
go ahead, Jeremy.
I think one thing to also bear in mind, pulling our discussion together, we started by talking about myths and how that relates to Conrad-Martius. And then we're bringing up Jung and Freud and psychology. I think a really key point here, and this is where I think Jung and Freud fall short, we're not talking about psychology. It's not a psychologism of mythology. Mythology is the disclose, in some sense, we could go on and on about that, but in some sense is the disclosure of the really real, is a perhaps indirect disclosure of this founding dimensions of reality, like the myth that the sky is a god, or when you look at the medieval worldview, that they literally saw heaven as being up in the sky, that somehow when you read Dante, heaven is reflected in the spheres, and Dante goes up there and meets Thomas Aquinas and everyone else, and that somehow that's derived from, and just the very idea of looking up, that's related to that. So I think that's kind of what perhaps you're trying to get at here. Remember what myth would mean for Conrad-Martius. It's a perhaps indirect or early or proto acknowledgement of the really real. It's not just something individual, personal, not just something psychological. It's ontological. I mean, does that? Yeah,
that's good. And Ricoeur's expression is quite nice here, that we're able through, say, myth, and through our naive views, to get things, to get food for thought, to have questions raised, start doing philosophy. But what she is saying, as Ricoeur does too, spend so much time on the origin of the account of evil, say in the Genesis passages, of how human frailty announces itself in the myth, but how it really does announce itself in our first person awareness. And similarly then with the Copernican revolution, and then it's being morphed into the Einsteinian, which is kind of a revolution of the Copernican revolution. She is suggesting that we can read many of the myths, and even especially as they are they're taken up into a somewhat philosophical meditation, or certainly a philosophical meditation by Aristotle, that we can approach with what Ricoeur would call the second level naivete. We retrieve something that was there, an insight that was there. Now we don't. I suppose we could say she's disposed to valorize myth as having an authoritative status because, you know, of her Christianity. But say Eliade, who was Russian Orthodox, I think originally, and I think he clung to that tradition pretty much. He was able to see in his beginnings, when he started getting into anthropology and the history of religions, he was able to see, wait a minute, you know, this is, there's similarities and there's differences. And what is that about? Well, if you get into the Boltzmannian mode, or you get into the hyper-Derridian mode, you've got nothing left. But Boltzmann at least has existence left. It becomes, and that's not merely what Ricoeur winds up with. He's doing an analysis of the will. And he's coming up with eidetic distinctions. He's doing, and they're true. At least that he aspires for them to be true. Jaspers and Boltzmann have done very good work and help us to read the myths with the second level naivete. Well, whether that's enough, whether the existential categories are enough, Conrad-Martius said no. That's a kind of radical idealism that she always, perhaps almost to the very end, faulted Husserl for. He didn't see. It's like, again, say with some of my favorite favorite thinkers presently, like Louis Lavelle and Michael Schaka. Nature's practically absorbed, robbed of any density, any interest, any complexity, or any encompassing meaning with respect to what spirit means, because it's merely an object. And it doesn't have an in itselfness from out of itselfness with an intellectual rooting of essential meaning. And so her position, her role in the history of 20th century thought is quite remarkable, I think, if it's true, you know, if we can follow it. And
you know, one thing that I've been kind of thinking about in trying to understand this idea that it's called the pneumatic being, or is that what it's called? Pneumatic being or archonic being and hyletic being create the world. And I'm just sort of reaching here, but to me, there's an issue of there are things in the world, even in the physical world, that in some sense are the medium or vehicle or essential to manifestation. Like physical light is essential to manifestation. An eyeball, which is a physical and a living thing, not a mind. You know, an eyeball is not a mind. Physical light is not literally a mind. And yet, and space itself is not literally a mind. And yet all of these things are not simply beings that appear, but also beings who themselves play a role in manifestation itself, the manifestation of everything else. Does this have something to do with her idea of the whole idea that hyletic being and pneumatic being themselves create the world. It's not simply that there are things in the world that have a function in knowing and perceiving, but somehow the very constitution of even physical reality as such, it's not simply that beings are manifest and that being is inseparable from manifestation as such, but that beings themselves as beings play an essential role in manifestation. And that's a way to understand, and that's part of what maybe she means by saying noetic being and hyletic being create even the physical world. Does that make any sense?
Well, I wrestled with this somewhere in there to the effect of, say, we're going back to the analysis of intelligibility, which is, we use the language of light, illuminating things throughout our whole vocabulary of philosophy. And typically we slide right into being a metaphor. And understandably, she says yes and no. She starts off the whole analysis of hyletic being in say, in your Erscheinungslehre and in realontology, with a theory of appearing, which is naturalist but non-reductionist, which is shocking for Husserlian. In other words, matter's being ecstatic is part of is a necessary condition for it being revelatory. And tied into that is an elaborate theory of light, that the ether, the ethereal aspect of hyletic being, its ecstatic character, helps her think about, or she thinks she illuminates the whole pressure on post-Einsteinian physics to see in the quantum material the electrons, which are dimensions of light, in the way we know light, somehow. And what she has in mind here then is that, however, what mind brings to hyletic being is a release. They're ecstatic. They're asking to be, material world is asking to be looked at and grasped, but it needs the agency of, use Tsiolkovsky's term, the agency of manifestation. But then also for certain forms, and I think she had acknowledged this, for certain forms like visual perception, you have three things interplaying for manifestation. You have the fundamental ecstatic self going beyond its selfness without a self of material being. You have the, let's say we're outside, we're in the woods, and we see something run. There's enough daylight for us to see it, but we couldn't see it without the daylight. But just the daylight and just the ecstasis of the hyletic being doesn't give the manifestation. The mind's light must meet light in order for there to be light. That's one of her key phrases for me. But Jeremy's absolutely right. This is not where most forms of transcendental or other forms of idealism are. And I myself incline to the more spiritualized version where I can forget about it. But Jeremy's giving reasons why we have to think about somehow manifestness, which phenomenology is all about, cannot eliminate the self-manifestation of matter.
So it seems like it's at least saying that things that we normally think of as merely material, such as a tree or as light, by itself is not self-manifesting, and yet somehow inherently, in its very being as hyletic, is somehow, that's a big somehow, but somehow oriented toward or patient of or inclined toward, open to, needing mind.
Right.
which is,
That's right.
and then what do we mean by mind? Do we mean my mind, something more than just my mind?
No.
And yeah, that would be at least what we'd have to say, something along those lines.
I must say, this sounds dreadfully close to religious language. Just a quick turn from the ecstatic givenness of objects towards us into something that is very comfortable within many, at least Christian orthodoxies, I'm imagining as well in other Orthodox traditions, Jewish, Islamic, the idea that the universe was created as an expression of love for the mind of those created in the image of God to observe, that our minds are here in a universe that almost demands us to see it and to love it in that way. Strikes me as getting slightly close to religious language. I don't know if anybody else is on that wavelength or perceives that at all, but
it's not slightly close, it's extremely close. It is, and Conrad-Martius was a Christian. And whether her notion of creation is orthodox or consistent with classical theism is a really, I mean, because it's also off. Another way to put it would be, I think there are plenty of people who might come from a more orthodox Christian view who, on the other hand, would say Conrad-Martius is dreadfully close to pantheism. And so, anyways, that's a real issue.
I hear a lot of this kind of debate about this, like, Catholic versus, pantheist and so on. But I think what strikes the contemporary, maybe Western American type, North American mind about all of this, and especially bringing all this metaphysics into the context of other representatives of phenomenology who are less metaphysical and more maybe even analytical, in their method and of doing phenomenology applied to language and and so on, is all this religiousness, and I feel like before we can get into the debates that the stakes between Catholicism and Protestantism, or Catholicism and pagan pantheism, with like the specific technical issues of the historical doctrines of Plato and Aristotle, and the received traditions of Plato and Aristotle, and of the church, and its positions on sacrament and such. I feel like the key issue is that there's this transnatural concept that might sometimes be called creation, and in the religious sense, that what she's doing that's so important is she's bringing it into a contemporary phenomenological ontology in such a way that it's something that need not be tied to a religion. I mean, it is for her, okay, and I appreciate that, and it's very powerful for anyone who's pious in any particular tradition. They can use this stuff, but I feel like for the Nietzschean, atheist, this stuff works as metaphysics, not only in the sense of a metaphysics that can be applied to like the interpretation of quantum theory, etc., but just like it stands on its own. I feel like it has something even more powerful than the state of religion today, and certainly something more powerful than the state of these academic fields, of kinds of philosophy. And that power, I feel like, is something that is holographically present in her overall schema, as well as present in the same structure in each of the little elements. And that structure is, I think, the how. When Jeremy, you said somehow, these things occur. I think the how is, sometimes it might have the name ontological dynamic, as in section, what is it, like 3.3, where it's a small section. It's just like a couple pages, but I feel like each of these sections are things that are present throughout, and sometimes you get this formulation of like the inward motion of like an instacy that has with it this corresponding ecstasy, you know, and maybe it might be expressed at a certain level as being about hyleticity without different pneumatic forms, and then like in pneumatic in the discussion of like 3, 6, 3, 7, you know, we can then divide this into how this same dynamic distinguishes plant from animal and animal from human. But I feel like this structure of like a ground on which to stand and then something arising out is the necessary structure to keep in mind. You know, that there has to be like say there's nothing, right? There's like the nothing. Maybe it's a epikoneia tesousias. Maybe it's the beyond of being. Maybe it's the Levinas's concept of the infinite or something, you know, whatever the primordial thing is, or let's just say it's light. It's just pure light or something, like in maybe in the Tibetan Buddhist sense, the clear white light, right? There needs to be like a little darkness at some point for some kind of creation to start, and maybe that's happening all throughout this field of light, which isn't a field spread out in space in the original instance, you know, in this hypothesis of an original, you know, creation from nothing, that Christian mystical nothing, you know, emptiness that's fullness, or whatever you want to call it. You know, there has to be a kind of ground and then a standing, and then within that all these other little grounds can occur and other standings on another level. But so then the levels, you know, everything starts getting more and more stratified and more you know, particularized until you have like an earth and people standing on it. I think it's a fine picture of like a creation from nothing, and I think that's operating here, and maybe even in a very precise sense in the idea of an ontological dynamic. I mean, I see this structure like in the analysis of time, for instance, but also in Husserl, you know, there's a kind of common structure you can see in when he talks about time, or maybe when he's talking more about psychological things. You know, there's like a center point. Maybe it's the now, maybe it's the lived body, maybe it's not a body, maybe it's just the transcendental ego. You know, so he'll use the same idea of like a center point, a zero point, a center point of orientation, etc. And then around that nucleus, we can build like a system, maybe a phenomenal field, you know. But I mean, I just feel like there's a common structure that's holographically present. Anyway, I mean, that's just my reading. That's like I impose this image when and I know I'm like not doing justice to all the details of all the traditions and you know, and to Conrad-Martius perhaps.
I think another way to look at it would be, you know, quite apart from religious traditions or beliefs, there are real questions that can be raised that are not easy to answer, like the very basic questions of philosophy. How is it possible for us to know anything? What does it mean that we have bodies that can see things? What does it mean that truth is, that it's meaningful to look for the truth, or that a statement can be true or false, or that we can see something confirm that a statement is true or false, or that we need and then if we ask that, we discover, well, wait a minute, even a particular statement depends on some kind of context of truth and the world. What do we mean by the world? And what is the role of the physical world in knowing? And what does it mean for something to be alive? And what is the relationship between a mind that can know, a body that's alive, electromagnetic radiation, and physical? I think it's by, one way to, I think, look at it is, how do people get to ideas like, well, you listed a whole bunch of ways, the nothing, God, mysticism. How do you get to those ideas? Well, I think they come up as reasonable, or they're motivated. They can well be motivated very powerfully, at least as possibilities, by really seriously considering the fundamental philosophical questions that actually even amongst analytic philosophers would be regarded as fundamental questions. What does it mean to exist? What does it mean to know? What is, etc.
You know,
So, and I think that's exactly what Conrad-Martius, that's where she's coming from. That's where Husserl is coming from. When we ask these basic questions, well, both of them find that we're led in this kind of direction. So they're not starting philosophically, they're not starting from religious faith. They're starting from the perennial basic philosophical questions.
Yeah, and this is something I wanted to come back to Jim on here, because one thing that you said, 20 minutes ago, sorry, I footnoted it, was the idea that a squared circle does not exist within the cosmos of the real, which I found very, very interesting to meditate on. But when you say that, and I interpret that through speech act theory to be something like the perception of an impossibility, I find that very, very interesting, because that's a phenomena which you communicated meaning from, and I experienced that part of our experience of a real cosmos is the idea of something being impossible, and that's important. I feel that presence, however you want to present it, as whatever chimera you wish. And I just wanted to get back to Jim on that particular difficult philosophical question of does Conrad-Martius discuss the conception of impossibility, the phenomenon of an experience of something being impossible?
Well, is this Renee? I don't remember for sure, except she does spend, time on the square circle and distinguishing it, say, from the way we presence the square circle. It's not going to be in a proper sense. It's going to be manifest. It's going to be something which our mind intends. But our mind can make present things which are not in the world. Because in the world, in this sense, and this goes back to Bill's questions or discussions earlier, in what sense is world being used here? But if it means that of which we can be aware, if that's all world beings, or that sense of world is being used, then obviously the square circle, because it can be brought before the mind as an oxymoron, as a self-contradictory phrase, that surely it's in the world in that sense, but that means world is whatever we are aware of. But Husserl spends a lot of time arguing that the transcendental I is not in the world. The manifestation of the world is not in the world. The acts of will by which we change the world are not in the world. So I think that would be one way I'd want to elaborate on that. But it doesn't mean that there is not something given to us which we call a self-contradictory phrase, a self-negating phrase, a self-negating, self-annihilating concept, and there's much more to be said about that in terms of the nature of the negation of itself, because obviously it's not negating itself, it's negating itself through the mind's manifesting as not possibly internally coherent, but it's not an act, intentional act of self-negation. I'll stop there. Renee, how's that?
Well, it was actually me who raised that, but I loved that. Thank you. Yeah.
I wanted to jump in here. I think that I have a question that's related to a lot of the themes that have been coming up. And especially in relation to the theme of constitution or transcendental questions, especially in relation to the realontology. And particularly as regards space, I think that a lot of the difficulty, at least the issues that I think that have been coming up in the last 20 minutes or so, kind of flip back and forth between transcendental questions about constitution of meaning, and the sort of ontological strangeness of the being that constitutes meaning, and how the ontological categories that maybe work in the world don't work for that. And then also, these themes of the really real. And it was funny because in the first couple of chapters, when her method when you were discussing her method, it seemed like transcendental questions, she kind of sets them aside so that she can talk about the really real. But then, and I see that she's doing that, and I think that that's a valuable move. But then when it comes to sort of the analyses of time and the analyses of space, it's almost like she can't set the transcendental question aside completely, because there's so many misunderstandings maybe, or so many conceptions of what time is and what space is that are tied to transcendental problems. So what my question is what's going on with space? So I think that with time, it was a little bit more clear how she was saying, the sort of what she was calling the imaginative transcendental time that retains the present and a protension, and then in a retention and projects in a protension, a sort of imaginative transcendental time. But I found the metaphor of the cardinal and the ordinal numbers really helpful for trying to distinguish what, a sort of temporal time and a time, as such. I don't know if you'd want to call it that. But when we got to the space section, I had a really difficult time trying to parse out what it was that was transcendental, what transcendental considerations were coming up, and then what was sort of part of the really real. And I wanted to ask the question because it seems so crucial also for her understanding of quantum physics that's going to come later. And then also, the sort of ontological interpretation of mythological categories, of mythological cosmological categories. And I just found a hard time trying to separate out what's going on in the space section. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that, Jim.
Well, Matthew, that's a really good question. I was thinking about that before we got together here. Transcendental seems to be in the sections on space and time a term of opprobrium. It's the transcendental imagination which accounts for all the conundra, the problems of the direction of time, and time is a flow and all that. And but similarly in space, the whole notion of the horizon as the background in which the focal object seems to go, in further space, which is implicitly intended by the perceptual consciousness. But that suggests then the Kantian and Newtonian understanding of space precisely as this empty container. And I don't think she wants to deny the fundamental structure of perception as focal object and background, focus and fringe, object and horizon. I think that's solid. That's a kind of fundamental given for the phenomenology of perception. But that the extrapolation or the explication of that in terms of Newtonian space is what she's concerned about. And transcendental there, when she uses it, it's transcendental space, it's obviously a term of opprobrium. It's not, it's missing, it's causing confusions, and we have to be wary of it. At least that's how I was reading it earlier today when I was looking at this. What did you think about that?
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I think that whatever I understand of the conceptual moves that she makes within it, it seems like the issue is the sort of typical antinomies that come up in Kant, for instance, and in Newtonian space, and she's trying to find a way beyond that by distinguishing between space in itself or something like space in itself, and then a sort of transcendental constitution of space, which has the horizon, and then there's this sort of implication in the horizon that it can extend and extend and extend. And then so with time, when she's talking about cardinal and ordinal numbers, and how you can sort of conceive of the present moment as a kind of perpetual annihilation, but it sort of holds on without a sequence to what's come before, in a sense, and that's kind of in the concept of the cardinal number as opposed to the ordinal number. I think once I got to the space question of, okay, so this is a problem that's coming from the way in which we perceptually constitute the world, this sort of notion of infinite space or something like that. But then I had trouble thinking about, okay, well, what is space then? And it seems like there's a lot mixed in there. There's the notion of the making space of hyletic being, which I'm not quite sure. I kind of grasp, but not completely. There's this interesting notion of the sort of eidetic topoi, or certain, or like forms that have certain places just inherent in their meaning or something like that. That's all just to say I had a really hard time fulfilling the intuition, so to say, of what's left to us then when the horizon is gone or something like that.
Can I contribute something here? Actually, I think that when we looked at passing time, I definitely had Husserl in my mind as well, internal time consciousness. And when we look at space, there's an analogous situation. I don't know if that helps, but how about this? There's Kant is totally present. She's talking about Kant. She's appropriating his transcendental aesthetic, not only the forms of space and time, but also the operation of transcendental imagination. There's a transcendental layer to all of these things, but at the same time, there's this other kind of space-time, and in Conrad-Martius, there's the transcendental category of space, which is this infinite manifold. Help me if I'm getting it wrong here, but so that's a pyrrhic. This is the category of a pyrrhic time, or I'm sorry, space or space-time, and then within that, there's this pyrrhic or metric sense of space-time. So we live in, say, the Minkowski-Einstein manifold, maybe identify that just to get an intuition of it with this 3+1 dimensionality of the room around us, right? But this exists within this much bigger framework of the apyrric space-time, the infinite space-time, which isn't limited to a 3+1 metric. And then within that framework, 8 meters and 3 meters and etc. That's how I visualize it, and I think I hope that does justice to it. I'm curious what Jim thinks. I mean, I don't know if everyone thinks of it this way or if it's just me, but the analogy of the discussion of space and of time in Husserl and Kant really forms a nice image, and I think it would have to, because that's kind of like what our world is. Our world is a paradigm for our images that we have when we schematize it, and vice versa. There's a transcendental paradigm, just like in Plato, that the world or the soul, the psyche, and the physical creation is an image of this broader paradigm.
Well, I think we're getting to some of the really difficult stuff here. On page 97, I got written here, she's been working on issues that she gets from Coy primarily, I think, and they're fascinating. That I think it's important to remember, she problematizes our ordinary experience, and that's it's dizzying. We think we have a pencil in front of us, and it's on the table in the room. But when we start thinking about it, And then we can move the pencil, into our pocket or, write with it or something. In the light of the analysis of the pencil and that in which the pencil is or upon which the pencil rests, we can see that there is an infinite divisibility of the pencil, of the table, and of the moving from here to there. And this is in the I guess it was Zeno's paradox, in the problem of the turtle and the rabbit. Would the rabbit ever catch the turtle? Well, not if it's the analysis of space is, that it's infinitely divisible. There are infinite. There's an apeiron, something which is able to be looked at in terms of this, what Randy's calling this infinite manifold. But obviously the pencil moves from there to there. Somehow it bridges from here to there, even though looked at in terms of analytic units, which themselves become infinite analytic units, which themselves become infinite analytic units, it can't move from there to there if we think of motion as a traversing of space, because it would take forever for it to cover all those units. But it does get from here to there. So this is the problem, one of the problems. But this is a problem of hyletic being too, because hyletic being is precisely this, which is infinitely divisible, and yet it is a finite unit in our field of perception.
Well, this is the question that I had from the beginning. So I'm not sure when she talks about the infinitely divisible aspect of space, or she doesn't talk about it in time, but in space, and as you say, in eidetic material. But I don't know what she means by that. Does she know that, or is that something that she's simply questioning some notion or a notion of space? Or is it that she thinks that she knows that it's infinitely divisible? You understand my question? Is this a metaphysical assertion, or is this something I don't know where she gets this, other than the fact that I know people have talked about it.
Oh, no, I think that's very good. And it goes back to what mantra Chomsky's I want to repeat, that we might say that the problem isn't spirit. Of course, it is a problem. It's a huge problem. But it's materiality, which is problematic. And although we don't have a perception, strictly speaking, of the infinite divisibility of space, we can, in principle, see the point that you cut it in half, then you cut the halves in half, then you cut those halves in half, and on and on and on and on. It belongs to the nature of a material body to be infinitely divisible. Not that we ever can pull it off, because it's an infinite divisibility. And there's this, excuse me, but just one sentence here that sounds like it's saying something wise here, but I'm not quite sure I get it now either. The traversability of the apeiron, of the infinite, is not a contradictory urphenomen, not a contradictory phenomenon, it's at the bottom of the page there, but is an essential impossibility. But she says it is, this is what we have to wrestle with when we're going to think space and materiality through, that it's not possible to in one sense, if you can't traverse it, it seems to me you can't think it through either. But that's not, but it's insofar as it's always more of the same, you have already thought it through. It's like the etc. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. It doesn't mean you got to infinity, but you you understand what it would be to keep counting. So, but then it's perfectly clear that part of this Urphänomen is not only what Randy was nicely calling the instasis, the infinity enclosed in any finite piece of anything in space, not in space strictly speaking, but for the convention in space. But it itself, as materiality, is ecstatic to itself. It's always going beyond itself. There's that pull within, and then there's that pull without. Now, I'm not sure how I keep this in mind, but it's in one sense, it's an illumination of the life world. In another sense, it's an utter shattering of how we experience things. So for me, it resonates. Chomsky says, we think we know what materiality is, and that's the problem. But what the problem is spirit. No. We haven't thought hard enough about materiality. And then so when she reaches her conclusion, that what we begin with in the life world are finitely abridged infinites, that we have to see that as somehow emerging into being, and enabling then this appearance. So there's a kind of for me, when I think of her realontology as a kind of legitimation and founding of the world of experience, at some levels, it does just the opposite. The perceptual world of experience, I get vertigo, and it's because you're so removed. If you're made to think that finite things do the impossible by bridging the infinite, then you have to come up with a different kind of a consideration, and that's where the entelechy come in the transphysical potencies, because this happens. But I'm not sure that it's not just a bunch of words either here.
I think what we're talking about sounds very complicated, because it is. And I think that's how it has to be in order to parse out, to analyze what's going on with the experience of things in space and time. First, we to understand them, we separate space and time into these categories of space and categories of time. And then each of them has another twofold, right? There's the transcendental form or category of space, transcendental category of time, and then each of those, and this is true for certainly for Husserl, and I think it's in Kant. There's a twofold to it as well. Each of these has twofolds, so there's like a twofold. So to understand how the miraculous presentation of an experience of an object moving through space and time, or of our being here, we have to place ourselves in the center of a kind of exploded diagram that is hypothetical, but maybe a necessary way of pulling out doubly what's going on here. And I don't think we'll be able to understand this diagram. This has been in the email. Jim and Rodney have shared this diagram with me recently, so this is out in the email world somewhere, but we'll talk about this later. And I know it's not coming into view quite. Yeah, but so I mean, you just see that the general schematic here of this wild diagram, and it has the category of I kind of imagine it's like here we are, right? This is like us in our space-time context, in our full lived experience. And then there are these wacky metaphysical categories way out here that interact with all these other categories. Some of them we're familiar with, some of them we're not so familiar with, but they include like the prote hyle, or the prima materia, which is the Urmaterielles, and then like, etc. There's this eidetic-analytic. This is a cool diagram, and I hope that we'll be able to talk about it in a more robust way later, maybe when we get into chapter 4 and talk about nature and anthropology, which is about where this diagram appears. But when we're talking about space and time already here, and materiality, there's a kind of unfulfilled intuition or unfulfillable intuition because it escapes, because it's transcendent and ecstatic. So this experience of like the coffee cup, right, is this Pyrrhic thing. It has limits, and I can divide it up indefinitely, you know, and smash it up. You know, and just the category of the coffee cup, right, is a metric category that I can, you know, analyze, you know, noetically, indefinitely. But there's a paradox there because there's also the actual coffee cup, and it's in the, there's like an infinite coffee cup too, you know. So there's an unfulfillable intuition.
Yeah, Randy, that's exactly what I was kind of thinking. And maybe I think this might be exactly the point that I think she's making by contrasting the apeiron of space with, and saying that actual finite things are in a sense unrelated or separate or on a different level entirely from the apeiron of space. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at there. Well, think of just like anything, like a coffee cup. It's in a certain place. We can see that it's separate from other things. It ends somewhere, and the air starts or the table starts, and it's definite and finite. However, if we think about measurement, and this is one thing Husserl was talking about, the origin of geometry is the taking of measurement to the infinite. Well, are we supposed to determine exactly what the borders of that coffee cup are? Well, that's a problem of measurement. And if we just think about it for a minute, we know, well, that would take forever. You can always make a measurement more and more and more accurate. But what does it mean for there to be a definite finite coffee cup? Does it mean it is infinitely determinate? But the idea of infinitely determinate is self-contradictory, because if you determine it forever, that means there's no determination. And
right,
I
so it's
think
like
that might be
paradoxical.
what she's trying to say about what does it mean that, and it seems like this is where the whole idea that things, Räumen, that they make space for themselves, but this making of space for itself is not a matter of infinite determination. It's like finite definite reality, in a sense, is a category and reality of its own. And then how that relates to the apeiron is a question, but it's somehow fundamentally different from the apeiron. And that's kind of the bridge, maybe. That's kind of how I may be starting to understand what she's talking about, if that makes sense.
If I just jump in for a second, I think that the one thing we have to keep in mind, I think, is that we, in terms of the ontological constitution of what she calls the finished world, we don't have space and time separately. Her analysis of space, of time, is inseparable from her analysis of the dilemma, or it's the essence, and yet it's a contradictory experience of the infinite divisibility of a spatial object. But it comes into being. We have that. That's where we begin. But if we bring in her theory of time, which is really problematic. I mean, Husserl and Bergson, for example, emphasize the time being a flow, and the whole point of the way that the past is not cut off from the present, but the present only means what it does in relationship to the retentions of the past and the potentions of the future. So there's a continuity. She objects to that, and sees a punctuality to the flow of time, and she thinks it's a kind of transcendental illusion to describe it as a flow, but rather she wants to accentuate the discreteness of the nows. And not only a discreteness in terms of an experience, because after all, there is the now. The now is not a retention, it's not a protension. It's absolutely different from the past and different from the future. So that's the basis of her argument there. But she ontologizes that, realontologizes. It's the coming into being of the thing we're talking about, which is a eidetic and or noetic thing. And so some of the problems we're wrestling, if we just rest on the conundrum of how something can be peric and aperic at the same time, but if we keep in mind that is a dynamism of coming into being, which the chief impulse of which is the existential quanta of the now. And the existential quanta of the now contributes then, and I'm not clear on this, when it's allied to the aperic and the peric spatial objects to the being as we know it. And that's tied up to what we started off originally, and what she started off originally in the Erscheinungslehre, that there is a self-ecstasy. I agree, I don't think this is this is the scholastic word for this was pars extra partes. This was the Latin Roman translation of the distendedness of a material thing. It was they're parts outside of parts. And when you but if you start, and this is where the whole problem of the Zeno's paradox and what hyle really is about, it's the parts are parts, or parts or have parts, if we're going to look at them in a certain light. But for her, if I get it right, this quantification of parts in terms of parts and parts of parts is at once the same problem of the now. The existential quantum of now is, in a way, if you refer to it as and make a noun out of it, it's infinitely divisible. And if William James, if you remember, he had recourse to the specious present. There is no present because you can't single it out. It's already gone or it's not yet. Because no single unit you can refer to it now. And this is, Husserl departed from that, but he says, no, there is the now, but it always is a retention and a protension. But it's always no longer and it's not yet.
This is also a problem in the reception of Aristotle and in the translations of this part in the physics, where he talks about the interval of the now and gets really into the definition of time as this interval that she refers to as well. Conrad-Martius has this discussion as we see, but the green, was it Loeb books of Aristotle will translate allo kai allo, other and other, as the different, and that works in some contexts, but it also misses that double pleonasm of other and other, of that double ecstasis.
But Aristotle does also have this precise problem, or this phenomenon, that now means both the nunc fluens, the flowing now, and the standing now. We experience both. Now is this, and so this is a parallel kind of challenge of her analysis of space. We experience space as bridged, but when we think about it, it's unbridgeable. And similarly, then, this is what James was getting at too with this. He thought it was a fake now, because it was always going away and always not yet, and it was connected inseparably to both. Well, what is the now? Give me the now. Well, it just went, or it's on the verge of going, or it's coming. I think what's in the phenomenology of perception, and what Husserl's whole problem of the lebendige Gegenwart, the living present, is very important here, because he is saying the same thing at the most fundamental level of experiencing. The experiencing itself is now. The Gegenwart here is a presence that itself isn't abläufend, isn't fastened away. even though it's an experience of a flowing now. The experiencing of the flowing now is not a flowing now. And this is really a fundamental issue in Husserl that has to be, that I don't think people have been clear enough on.
Yeah, in fact, I think in the internal time consciousness lectures, there's this diagram that's vectorial with the arrows, and this shows, this emphasizes everything he says about the flux of time. But there's also another diagram that could be like superimposed on it that's static. So I think even there,
Yeah,
he
but
has
that
both.
diagram is not about a static, the diagram is static.
Right.
What it's referring to is the vertical and horizontal. And you can see the now points on that diagram is different. But you see at the same time, that other diagram with the lateral is that the now is always the now of a not of a no longer and a not yet, which itself is moving. So it's capturing both the nowness as stand, as abiding, and the now as fluens or flowing.
And I think another thing about the no longer and not yet, I think this may relate to what Conrad-Martius says about the so-called quantum nature of now. And I don't think this is something Husserl really brought to the fore, although it's implicit, which is, what do we mean by the very next moment? The very next moment. That is something that is in principle absolutely impossible to objectify. And it's absolutely in principle impossible to count one and then the very next moment. And yet, now is always completely, absolutely distinct. And so I think an important thing about, I'm kind of puzzled when I read about, in her treatment of time that I've started to get into, when she called it, she wants to quantize nows. I think it relates to this issue we're talking about, but I'm pretty sure that she is saying that she does not mean you can count them, or that here's one and here's the very next one. Right. She's definitely not saying that. Right. Somehow it's quantized, but it's not like there are a certain number of them, or you have one and then another, or there's a very next one, or that by sort of bringing them together, you get a continuum. No, it's something outside of that. And then in a way that probably it's not possible to kind of fit all this together. Am I kind of maybe on the right track here with this?
Well, I certainly, it's nothing that this is, again, James's species present. It's not, now one obviously is not now two, it's not that sort of thing. And yet the flow, if we're just emphasizing the continuum, as we might emphasize a continuum in empiric spatial objects, already bridged, but we don't experience either distinct quanta. We do experience a continuity, but still now is not yet or no longer. And but I guess to go back to the complexity of the space analysis we have here, similar, I think, and I might be wrong, but I think we have to keep in mind that we understand the coming about of a spatial object, not only in terms of its being a bridge of the infinity, the empiric realm, but it's also being an actual by reason of its if it's coming into being from out of the empiric realm. Now,
I wanted to say about I think that this will relate back to the space conversation too, about the now and about James. It seems like one of the issues is that what seems real is kind of characterized by having an abiding presence, but the condition for the possibility, the present, doesn't itself have an abiding presence. And so you can't say that, that it is, because it doesn't have that characteristic to it. And it seems like you don't get something like punctual nows or a holding together of the now until you have something like in the ancient sense, a soul, or in a phenomenological sense, sort of the transcendental time constituting ego that can hold on to what just happened and also sort of on the basis of that project forward into sort of like determinacy of possibilities based on, you know, what's just happened. And I think that the way that I understand the move that she wants to make is to say, we constitute the world, but can we sort of set aside this question of the being that holds on to the present that just passed and projects into the future, and ask just sort of the sort of like burgeoning or coming forth of whatever time is without the holding on. And I mean, there's some sense I think that it holds on, but not in the way that that a soul would or something like that. And in the space, in the space problem is similar, and that you have and then I understand that the structure of the problem is similar. It's how do you conceive of the sort of making room, how do you conceive of spatiality without the being that can measure, the being that can divide up, the being that, which is the same thing in terms of time. You have the being that can count, even though it's not an explicit counting act. There's, you know, that might be our ability to sort of hold on. It's not really that it just happens kind of willy-nilly. Is like, how do we think about it beyond that? How do we think about what's going on beyond that?
Well, I think there, Matt, if I can say this, I think that she would handle that, say the ultimate gestalt of that which comes to be out of the aperic realm. It's already besouled with the transphysical potency. And so that already has a kind of mind, a kind of unit of intelligibility, its essence. If it's a frog, you know, it's a piece of copper, it's this, that, or the other thing, you know, it's going to have that as we're shaping it up. But I think with the dilemma with the time consciousness, Aristotle's point too, it's not only Husserl, obviously, time is the measurement of motion with a before and after. So this is the measurement of emotion is by obviously a quote Aristotelian transcendental ego. But the I think that she didn't want that, and just to make a jump here. She gave an analysis of this time position as its discrete existential quanta. I think I've said this before. And a marvelous essay that I think appears in volume 1 of the writings. And written about the same time as Heidegger's analysis of time and being and time. But it wasn't, if I recall, she might have had some room for pretensions and retentions there, but the chief thing was that she held the existential quanta view. But then she rejected it, and this goes back to Renee's point, for theological reasons. That in the time book, she brings this out, that we don't have, if this analysis holds that things come into being punctually, God is constantly creating the universe. God has not created a universe. There's never the universe created. It's always coming to being. It's an ongoing task. And God's busy all the time creating. So he's not the creator, he's creating. And this is, of course, this is a theological issue, you know, of the difference between creation and what providence or the sustenance, continuing creation. But she felt that if all of being was due to this discrete quanta, being quanta, so we wouldn't have a creation. God, it would always be, everything would be a miracle. Because there would be a fundamental, there would be no lawfulness from one moment to the next. And so she ascribed then, and this is really puzzling. She ascribed the emergence of time as the being quanta in the present, because present and presence have to go together. She ascribed that to the ionic world periphery. That is where even so in that way she has a radical creationist view, in the sense that her God creates a creator, and the creator, as it were, the ionic world periphery seems to be all, except it's spread out and that she doesn't use the word demiurge, but there is all that's necessary for creation is contained in the world, ionic world periphery, except that it has been brought into being by the creator itself. It isn't there from all eternity. So it's the most robust view of a creator creating creatures who are creators, namely the ionic world periphery is the creator of all the world we know it, but it itself is created. So,
I'm sorry, but I just want to say that's kind of this ongoing self-affectation. So
no.
Is this also this world periphery? Is that also the, I want to say place, but is that also the sort of the place in a metaphorical sense of the entelechy?
Yeah, that's right. It is, and I think it's someone else has to write this book. Now who understands it better than I did, but it's hard to say. As Randy's frequently indicated, you need to keep a kind of diagram in mind. But what I think I think the most robust claim for the ionic world periphery, or the trans-intellectual potencies, is when she tries to account for development or evolution and emergence. There we have a kind of a concrete picture of how this fertilized egg, is the beginning, or is in fact the beginning of Einstein or Jesus or whomever, and we have then, and how is there in this fertilized egg the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven? How do we have that there? And that's where the entelechy, because we have this, what I was referring to earlier, this quasi-psychic, quasi-psychological, quasi-mind in entelechy, because it's structure giving, it's informing with intelligibility without itself being a mind. She was tempted to, as I think Abi Lalamont once said, to take the move of antiquity with a world soul, say in Plotinus, and then you would have kind of extensions of the world soul through our souls and everything. But you'd have the meaning of the world would be tied to a world soul. And we would understand the finished universe by going back to its soulfulness, but the soulfulness of all the plurality of souls would be rooted in a mind that was subordinate to the one. She rejected that. That temptation was a temptation for her. It was, first of all, she was much more complicated like that, and that would be compete. The noose then would be in conflict with the hen. You'd have two gods.
I have a question about what we've been talking about here, and it's been helpful for me. So as I understand it, we're speaking about how out of an infinity comes the finite. Out of infinity, out of infinities or infinity comes the finite. It comes into being. Now, some people would speak about that as out of non-being becomes being. But if I did that, then I'd be making equivalence of beingness and finiteness. So is it more appropriate and better to speak of finiteness coming out of infinities rather than speaking in terms of beingness? Do you understand the question?
Bill, you have to try it again. I'm sorry. My hearing is getting worse.
Probably. Maybe worse than mine, Jim. I've only got one good ear. So, so I'm trying to, because a lot of people, like maybe even Heidegger, might speak about being coming out of non-being, but I don't hear her using those terms.
No.
We're talking in terms of infinities coming out of infinities coming finiteness, and the finiteness of things which we can, which are like kind of objects, if you like, that we can experience. And so I want to get clarification about it's out of infinities or infinity that we don't really understand that comes finiteness. And this is happening almost moment by moment and things like that. And not being versus non-being.
Yes, I think that's something like that. You have the finished universe, which is a universe of finite beings, but it's rooted in kinds of infinities, of quasi-mind-like substances, which are entelechies. And they are Platonic forms in some sense. They are in some sense the Gestalt principles. We're not talking about merely meanings. We're talking about actual real beings in the world that make up a world. They have to be wedded to something like the Aristotelian prote hyle, the prime matters. They have to have a principle of potentialities. They are act, but they're acts wedded to potentialities. They're not pure act, but that gives them their dynamic character of bringing about of a finished being by an actualization of potency, which is inherent in the entelechy. And when the discussion of Driesch that will be coming up with later on, I think that he was a very distinguished philosopher who got into philosophical biology, and he first used the category of entelechy but he had his entelechy was kind of not. It was like a plan, a finished plan that overrode or presided over all the nitty-gritty details of Helletic substances. But no, for her, the entelechy is more like a soul that is in the midst of things. And you might find interesting how she gets to that position, because she's read all these experiments about taking eggs and putting them in a kind of a milkshaker and twirling them around, and whether the eggs were the sum of the parts, or did all the the entity which the egg was an entity of, was it whole in each of the parts? And the various theories that were proposed that we'll look at, like preformism and holism and so forth, she comes up with the entelechy, because wrestling through all these theories of how, this fertilized egg, brings about the adult or the mature organism. When a lot is done to, say, the fertilized egg. And so in some cases, it seems to have an integrity in spite of what you do to it. So that her theory of the entelechile structure of the universe emerges out of, and I'm a little cold on it, obviously, as you can tell that, emerges out of especially out of, and this I think helps to see what we're immersed in the infinity of aperic stuff, and we can easily get lost there and lose the larger picture. And so we'll see that when we look at the biological material that we'll discuss soon, we'll see that how the entelechies emerge, and then what we've discussed now in terms of Helletic stuff, of the basis of all materiality, that's always integrated into a form. We just don't have hyle. And it's an ecstasy and its existential quanta. What we have, are squirrels and in our neck of the woods, especially cicadas and people, and but why we posit at the foundation of the world, but which also is in her picture, the periphery of the world, aeonic world periphery, we have that at the foundation, because it's all soaked with meaning. It's soaked with typical kinds of agency and typical kinds of creativity. But the beginnings of all of that are in this created dimension of the aeonic world periphery, or the transphysical potencies. And I think if I want to urge people, I think Randy's recommendations are very good for the visualization. If you look at what Rodney had us attach to the book, that slice, that chapter from the metaphysics of the earthly, which is where that diagram originally came from that Randy was showing us. What she's talking about there is some of the most fundamental issues that she is, as I mentioned earlier, revolutionizing the Copernican revolution. And insofar as the Einsteinian view revolutionized the Copernican revolution, she's revolutionizing the revolution of the revolution in terms of a picture of nature, or a view of nature. And she's also kind of saying to Husserl and transcendental phenomenology and idealists like myself, and as Randy as Jeremy suggests, that there's something materialistic about the spiritual event of cognition and the human spirit, that it isn't separated by an abyss, that there's this cooperation somehow, this integral cooperation in the whole realm of manifestation. She is insisting that the agency of manifestation of the transcendental I has to be working in harmony with the realm of the Einsteinian ether, electrons, and so forth, because that is the fundamental basis of physical things being outside of themselves and luminous. But it needs not only the natural light, it needs also the spiritual light, or the agency of manifestation, for there to be in the manifestation which phenomenology is busy with. Yeah, this was, but we have to think of this. Obviously, we're looking at it looks like two dimensions. We have to, as Randy is urging, we have to find out the right 3 or 4 dimensions in which to look at this thing. But it all congeals in the human being. But where do we put then these various things, and what spatial, excuse the word, spatial juxtaposition? So it helps us to bring this all together. And I myself confess to not being there yet.
Yeah, it's like a beautiful crystal.
So Randy, you kind of inferred, is this diagram something you distilled? No. Or is it something, or what's the basis of it actually?
Rodney should answer that question. Is Rodney still here?
No, he had to go actually.
Oh.
Maybe you can tell us what you know, Jim?
Well, I got a hold through, I think, a friend of Conrad-Martius, a psychiatrist, Gisela Kaldenbach, this text called the Metaphysik des Irdischen, the metaphysics of the earthly. And I eventually shared this with Avi Lallemant, and now it's, I hope the original's in the Bavarian Public Library in Munich. And so this is just a page, but if you read the end of this dissertation, you have our translation, Rodney's, my translation of an important chapter from this work, which she never completed. She kept wanting to come back to it, and this would be an introduction to all of her, her system. And that's because we're dealing with such nitty-gritty issues. We can easily lose the forest for the trees. And I think that if we keep in mind the larger picture, You know, and then here I see now that we have the Urmaterielles. This is the realm of potency, especially, and the or hyledic, and the Oriteriches, and this is the light principle that deals with the fundamental structure of Wille. But then we have the other principle, as Jeremy pointed out, which, you know, we have the principle of spirit and soul at the other, you know, but they all are integrated with one another, obviously in a variety of ways to account for the material. But I think if we keep in mind her struggle against the post-Copernican revolution, which was what Kant picked up on, the Newtonian revolution, it's what, and for me it was important because remember all those passages in the Bible where we have the heaven is up and the ascension and all of that, and we had the reworking of that in terms of in the demolition of that in terms of the whole movement called demythologization. And she, along with Eliade and lots of other people, felt no. Our original naive view of the world as it appears in myth, you know, had much more going for it than the utterly puzzling, opaque universe in terms of our theological proclivities and our mystical proclivities and our faith orientations. And I think that if but she was a nitty-gritty thinker. I mean, she doesn't say she felt philosophy did analysis and had to get into details and make distinctions and so forth. But they're very difficult ones. But if you somehow have to keep in mind when we get lost in the details, the larger picture, and that's partly that'd be. Did you send that around to us, Randy?
Yeah.
Good.
It's in our email chain, and I'm hoping we can talk about it more and more. So we'll see more of this. Sure. Yeah.
And we have to keep it in mind. But I think what we wanted to together is work out move it from, say, pedagogically, move it from as it were, a two-dimensional plane to, because it's all on the same plane. It isn't all on the same plane. But Mensch, the human being, brings it all together, but his tentacles, as it were, or his roots better, go off in all directions. But how best to capture that rootedness through other third dimension or fourth dimension?
And
go ahead.
So this appears, by the way, in a footnote, or there's a mention of it, and that's what inspired me to ask Jim and Rodney about this diagram, because this footnote wasn't in the 1972 dissertation. It's just in the 2020 book.
Oh.
That footnote is 148 on page 158. So it mentions this diagram, you know, so that's where this is coming from. But as I was reading on,
of what book is that from?
Of Jim's book, the Hedwig Conrad-Martius Ontological Phenomenology. So that's.
So where did you actually get this diagram? Did you reconstruct this, or is this her actual diagram?
No, this is maybe Gisella's drawing, handiwork.
No, that's wrong. That's not so. This is I if it was anybody's, I more likely think it's Conrad-Martius.
Oh.
But it might be Avi Lelemant with her, but I can't think that she's not part of the picture here. And this belongs to the Metaphysik des Irdischen. That's where this is from.
Right.
And I want to once again say that's easy reading, and it gives you all a kind of accessible picture of the whole. And when we get, as I certainly do, get lost in the almost quicksand of the instasis of the indivisibility of space, and then have to move out it and put a bridge over it and come back to the real world. I need to keep this in mind, because those analyses all lead to, to this picture. We got to keep this picture in mind, and that picture is already somewhat sketched in the appendix to the book, which is the Metaphysik of the Earthly.
I want to add, though, that although the footnote appears a few pages before, the real discussion there's some discussion of these categories that especially comes up in section 4.8, the natural formation of the spirit soul of man. Naturally, of course, man is in the center here, and then all of these roots, come out of that and come out in the explanation in those sections.
That's good. Yeah, that would be a place to look for that too. Very good. Yeah,
there's another diagram. Well, I'll tell you. Well, so there's another diagram in the history of philosophy that is like this, in that man is at the center of, in particular, a double infinite. Paul Ricoeur talks about this. This is the center of his philosophical anthropology and fallible man. But he's picking up from Leibniz, and there's an essay called "The Double Infinite of Pascal." And the monad, and Tymieniecka, this is also a structure in her philosophical anthropology. So both Paul Ricoeur and Anna Teresa Tymieniecka have this philosophical anthropology of which there's this diagram where man's in the center and the double infinite, the infinitely great and the infinitely small, or God and nothing, are at the periphery.
I guess I'm curious, where did you get this actual picture?
It's from the manuscript that she was working on it, Jeremy. She had this all written, I think, I forget what we have down there, but I think she had done this in the 30s, or quite early on, maybe the 40s. It says in there somewhere. But at the same time, she was working on these volumes, which were the more nitty-gritty version of the Metaphysik des Irdischen, but she cherished the Metaphysik des Irdischen, the metaphysic of the earthly text, because it was going to be her introduction to the whole. Realistically, someone picking up Die Zeit or Der Raum or Selbstaufbau der Natur, these are difficult texts. And so this was going to be, I think, the way she was going to pull it all together. But she died before she integrated, reworked this book. But Rodney, thought it would be good to stick it in as an appendix, because I think now it was a wonderful idea, because if we have to keep going back to what it was important for her to see that the Copernican revolution, which still is with us insofar as Kant is with us, and Kant is going to be with us probably forever. But Husserl was also tied to Kant in many ways, just with the very notion of a transcendental philosophy, that they spiritualized with the whole theme of constitution. This is the problematic topic. Constitution in Kant really means our shaping what is presented to us. It has an agency of shaping the world. But the agency of manifestation, Husserl didn't like that. What we do, we manifest there. Now we're going to have to keep revising. We're going to have to be doing this. But manifestation isn't the same, strictly speaking, as constitution. But even with the notion of constitution as manifestation, and Jeremy will get this with Lavelle, who's very robust on all this, still if the sovereignty practically of the notion of the agency of manifestation as the agency as constitution as manifestation, we have, say, in Lavelle, we have it in I think Shaka too. We have a depreciation of nature's inherent intelligibility and its own functioning as Jeremy was pointing out earlier, in our manifestation. It's not utterly cut off. Our spirits are not. She's not espousing, strictly speaking, a substance dualism. She is naturalizing manifestation, in some ways naturalizing spirit, but without a reduction. Not a reductionist materialism. But it is a materialization in many ways, but it's also a spiritualization. And she just felt that her mentor, her Meister, didn't do justice. And that's that last one of those last essays where she tries to bring it all together in the essay on transcendental and ontological phenomenology. She tries to bring it together. But I think our working through this right now, we see what she really has in mind there, why it's a mistake to make nature, as it were, a tabula rasa, a blank slate upon which, in a Kantian sense, we impose our forms, either our transcendental forms, our transcendental sides, or our constructive groping constructs. So she's kind of, manages to alienate herself, put it that way, from the whole phenomenological movement by occupying a position here that neither Husserl nor any of her colleagues were up to. And I think in the 20th century, it's also a kind of, because if you look at her historically, she is really kind of offering a cosmology of manifestation. Phenomenology is the essence of manifestation. Here's Henri's book title. But it purports to be an absolute philosophy, and she felt it couldn't unless it dealt with what she calls real being as realontology, rightly or wrongly. And that means manifestation has also to be, in some sense, rooted in, tied to nature. It's a hard, it's a hard road to hoe. It's a tough job, but it's a fascinating that she came up with this. And put everybody to sleep. So anyhow.
So it's not just naturalizing. I don't think she would go along with a lot of people today who jump onto this phrase naturalizing phenomenology. She's up to something quite a bit different.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Because I think she's just as much spiritualizing nature as she's naturalizing spirit.
Yes, good. I think that's a good way to put it.
And yet she's dealing with, I think, a lot of the same questions that come up with this whole sort of project of naturalizing phenomenology.
No.
So the questions are shared, like Evan Thompson, what he writes about, it's related to that.
No.
Too bad he doesn't appreciate her, but I think it can have a dialogue with that whole project of naturalizing phenomenology, but it's also going to be a very critical dialogue from her perspective.
I think that's right.
Regarding Evan Thompson and this program of naturalizing phenomenology, Evan Thompson does it through the vehicle, at least in part, of his work with Francisco Varela and what's called autopoietic theory of life. And there's an interesting analogous thing in Anna Teresa Temeniecka's phenomenology of life, and she calls it ontopoiesis. And she actually has, in the 90s, interfaced Varela and talked about these the similarities between her ontopoiesis, which is a transnatural phenomenology of life, and Varela's naturalized autopoietic definition of life. And anyway, it's a really interesting discussion, and I think it really does reflect the differences of the sense of naturalization in the phenomenology of Conrad-Martius from like naturalization in the like empirical, reduction of like Evan Thompson and that sort of thing. And I'm trying to talk to him about this.
I don't think Thompson is exactly a reductionist, but I think there are other, and I'm not all that familiar, but I think there are other people who go further in this, what they call naturalizing phenomenology. But there's a definite project and dialogue going on that I think really is focused on a common set of issues.
Yeah.
So,
So we're actually at the end here, and you know, if there's any other things about this, you know, we can keep talking for a moment, but in a moment we should also look at our calendars. I don't mean to cut you off, Jim. Did you want to say one more thing?
No, I found some, you know, good parts of today's helpful. I mean, especially this last part with the whole problem of in what sense, and but I'm personally convinced that there's something to the notion of intellectual light, and I'd like to insist that it isn't a metaphor, because Aristotle illuminates light, uses light when he wants to say how things come to light, when the sun illuminates the environment and then things spring forth. But Aristotle, I say, they don't spring forth for the squirrel or for the person unless there's an illuminating agency in the squirrel and the person. The illuminating of the acorn under the leaf, and then the wind blowing it and the light shining on it, would not be any manifestation to the squirrel of that acorn unless that acorn was in the situation that Conrad-Martius describes as already being luminous, self-luminous. And that's the nice part of her. Light must meet light in order for there to be light. You have three lights there. Let's say you have the light of the nature, the moon, sun, stars, flashlights, artificial lights. But you have then the light of the intelligibility of the holetic substance as suffused with an entelechy, namely its inherent intelligibility. But unless there's a dative and an agent of manifestation there is no intelligibility. And I think that has to be part of this discussion of the naturalization of phenomenality, especially in the light of the conundrum of modern sciences offering a view of nature which make this display of, or the manifestation of nature, utterly unintelligible because it doesn't have a way of accounting for mind. And I don't think that's necessarily a burdensome theological move to want to say that mind, spirit, or whatever we want to call it, has to be part of nature in order for science to happen, in order for nature to be recognizably natural. In other words, the intelligibility and the manifestation of nature are not incidental to nature. Now that requires a pretty broad metaphysics. And we do have the inheritance of, you know, the legacy of the category of the imago Dei, you know, the made in the image and likeness of God and so forth. And we have the whole theological tradition. But I think it's a fundamental philosophical challenge to naturalists how the categories that they use to account for manifestation don't add up. And even if you got a robust notion, the naturalized version of mind in terms of brain, still the manifestation by science is not accounted for. So I think that's all part of her agenda. And in some places it's, you know, better worked out than others, but in integrating spirit, as Jeremy says, and materiality as part of the whole show, the spirituality of matter and the materiality of spirit, that these are not just phrases or gestures for her. She's tried to work it out. And but you know, we've all, you know, I think we'll acknowledge it's keeping it all together and putting it all together is a rough road to hoe.
Well, I also hope that it will become easier, I think, when we get a better grasp on it, and it'll just be, it'll go from being something we have to hold and bring together and have these very difficult diagrams into something more intuitable. You know, like phenomenology is a way of seeing, and having the eidetic vision, you know, is a great power in science and in life. You know, it's a spiritual power.
Good. There's like simple expressions that you use, you know, the finished universe. But she's interested in how it got to be finished, you know, and that's interesting. You know, it's if you get the eyes that Randy's recommending, that she, you know, she would have as the lens or the goggles, you see that it's finishing itself, its process. It's process, and it's a process of levels of intelligibility. But it's also self-manifestation. And again, that the dative and the nominative and the agent of manifestation are part of the picture, as well as not being able to be part of the picture, because it makes the picture possible. It is and is not in nature. I would want to be Husserlian enough to not have the transcendental ego utterly part of nature. I wrote an essay on that, why the whole notion of individuation in Conrad-Martius, I think, isn't satisfactorily handled. One is confined to the ionic world periphery. Each of you and I are already, as it were, have our transphysical entelechy in this transphysical realm. I don't think I would, as a irrepressible theologian, I want to say that what I refer to in the first person singular is not already worked out. And even my vocation is not worked out in the transphysical realm. I find her in the book on, what is it? The Guy Sala that's mentioned is one place she talks about that. But anyhow, that article's, I might have included it here in the bibliography, but I can send it to Randy. He can, I think I have a copy of it. I'll send that around to you. Maybe I sent it already. Did I? Randy, that article?
Which one are you talking about?
The problem of individuality in Conrad-Martius or something like that.
Okay, I'll make sure to send it out. I think I have it. Yeah.
No, because it's just, I find this a real problem. But because I think spirit is somehow different from what we call nature, and yet I think I am inclined to what the reproachful term angelism, insofar as I could work better on the phenomenology of mind than I can in nuclear physics and biology. There's a competence beyond.
And if I remember right, in your 1,000 pages of who one is, that's really a core claim. The whole thing you were working on, I think, is really to back up, if nothing, maybe one of the main core claims is to back up what you just said, that somehow the rootedness of an ipseity is not simply in nature, even in the sense, in the spiritualized sense of nature of the transphysical realm.
No.
It's beyond that in God.
No. I think so. And, but that's, she balked at that, you know, but she's a remarkable thought thinker. So I see that Bill has his hand almost up, or he's framing himself.
Well, let me just read this line, and then I'm going to hit stop recording, and then we'll look at the schedule. When at night all lights are out, we can see nothing. Similarly, in the daylight, should we be blind, we see nothing. In order for the milieu to be visible, it itself and we ourselves must be enlightened.
No,